Well, thanks for coming. My name is Mark Sutton. I work for Electric Cloud. I'm a recently anointed director of customer success. I run a mid-market sales team as well for the company. I've been with them for a year. I started life off as a software engineer way back when. I worked at companies like Rational and Lockheed in the day, and kind of got involved with the software engineering tools side of it when I ended up at Rational, and I've been there ever since. And it's been a lot of fun. I've learned a lot along the way. I spent some time at Rally, did some Agile stuff, and I'm here now. I've been in the DevOps space, had some time at CloudBees. I know a little bit about Jenkins and a whole bunch about Electric Flow. So I'm not going to talk about any of that. I'm going to talk about KPIs to help us bridge the gap between DevOps and the business. So let's just go ahead and get into it. Just a real quick outline. We like to talk about journeys. Where are you guys on your DevOps journey? We're going to have a short journey here today. We'll talk about what I mean by BizDev Ops, and there's a million definitions out there. We'll talk about how do we get it right, and that's really the heart of the matter, right? Want to focus in on some metrics so that, maybe if you walk out of here with a fresh idea or two, maybe not a lot of definitive, I'm going to go back and do this, but an idea or two, I think we can declare victory at that point. How do you know? How can you collect these metrics? How can you harvest them and understand if things are headed in the right direction or not? And then how do you mechanize or operationalize to get that information? So those are the big areas that I'd like to go over. So what the heck is BizDevOps? Well, I'm a big fan of word clouds. This is a fun one. I took a bunch of articles and a bunch of stuff I've been reading on BizDevOps and DevOps and crammed it into a cloud or word cloud generator, and this is what came out. I kind of like a couple of them. BizDevOps is obviously really big in there. Perspective, approach. I was really happy to see those because that's what I wanted to talk about, my perspective on approach to this. And of course, lots of other good stuff. Some of them, they're a little wonky, but that's how word clouds are unless you spend a lot of time refining them. But the point here is there's lots and lots of definitions, right? Just like, what's a release, right? What do you mean by release? What does she mean by release? What do you mean by deploy? BizDevOps, how do you do DevOps? How do you define DevOps? There's no standard definition. BizDevOps, we'll define our own for today. I think it'll be pretty consistent and pretty usable by everybody. But what I want to do first is introduce a framework. And this framework is going to recur throughout the talk and be a basis for us to make some observations against and maybe some speculations. But we'll start off with the business, because without the business, there is no DevOps, right? That's where everything comes from. That's what we're doing it for. And typically in our world, hopefully, folks are using some sort of an agile-based approach that starts off with strategization, coming up with good strategies for the products we want to build, and then planning those. And there's a lot of great ways to come up with strategies. There's focus groups, there's this and that, there's surveys and customer feedback and cabs and all kinds of great things like that. But once you get this massive data, you have to synthesize it a little bit, you have to massage it, you have to rank it, you have to order it, and then you get it into a plan. People usually use epics and stories and use cases. How many folks are doing Agile? Those words ringing a bell good. Excellent. So that's kind of where the business side of this comes in our definition. Dev, I think this will be pretty non-controversial, certainly hope so, right? That's where the building and the testing, kind of following through on the planning piece of it, putting the plans into action, building some stuff, running some tests, and then operationalizing it into production through delivery and ops. With me so far? Making sense? Pretty simple framework, BizDev Ops. That's how we're going to lay it out for today. Okay, so let's then try to work out a definition so we can talk a little bit more. We'll start with DevOps this time. And what I want to do is look at the value exchange between DevOps and the business. If we put this much resource into DevOps, how much value do we get out? That's what I mean by the value exchange. So what business benefit are we getting from that exchange? Similarly, we can look at the value exchange between the business and the market. If the business puts this much digital value out there, what does it get in return? And what does that trade look like? And how efficient and effective is it? These are the things that I'd like to start measuring so that I can understand if I put more input into A, what kind of a response do I get out of B? Just like when I'm driving down the freeway and I want to pass a car, put an input into the accelerator, I expect the car to go faster. What kind of an expectation can I have in my business if I'm in the driver's seat from stomping on the gas for DevOps and for IT to develop new functionality? That's the heart of what I'm trying to get at. So there's a definition that we'll work with. I'll just let you guys read that while I take a sip of water. Any questions at this point? Okay. So BizDev Ops bridges DevOps performance data with business performance data to deliver a better understanding of how the DevOps team is supporting the business. Okay, pretty consistent so far, I think. Making sense. So why? Why do we care about measuring all of this? Why do we care about getting BizDev Ops right? Well, it's for all the reasons we care about getting DevOps right, as it turns out. We want to be able to do things faster, better, cheaper, stronger, and return more value. The interesting part is things kind of break out, these benefits break out into 5 or 6 areas. I've got 5 of them, 1, 2, 5 listed here. Service quality, operational efficiency, service velocity, customer value, organizational effectiveness, and business performance. You can find a nice article by the Gartner team, a nice analysis that goes into a lot of depth in those areas. If you are Gartner clients, you can get access to that, and I'd highly recommend that for further reading. But the benefits that I like to focus on, let's dive into business performance for a second. Access to new markets, increased market share, improved profitability. These are all good things. How in the world do I relate the DevOps function back to those things and measure it? Let's take a look and see if we might be able to find some metrics that do that. But before we do, we want to talk about a mechanism to get us there. And I call that the value delivery cycle. So here's our framework again. We introduced the BizDev Ops framework. Typical life cycle, starting at the very beginning, going to the very end. Obviously, we need to be able to measure certain aspects of that framework. And what we'd like to do then is to be able to take the data that we collect and assess it, transform it, manipulate it, put some analytics against it, put some trending against it, visualize it in ways that make sense, and distill it. And then the important part is to close the loop, right? And bring it back into the strategy. I'm going to stay away from that other word I tried a while ago. Back into the strategy definition part of the life cycle. Feed what we learned in and what we're seeing as feedback in this now closed system that we've created. Okay? So as it turns out, there's a bunch of groups of metrics and benefits that come out when we look at this. We can categorize things and come up with a way of breaking things down and looking at them and tracking them. And so let's take a look at what those are. I gave quick reference to them before, but first we might want to track business performance. That's concerned with the business value to the market and the business of what we're doing internally in IT, right? There's another intersection on this Venn diagram where DevOps and business intersect, and there's a couple of good areas there, customer value and service quality. I think we can all see how those might map into that piece of the Venn diagram. We're interested in applicability of the features we build. Why do we want to get really fast at building features that nobody ever uses, right? Wouldn't it be nice to know if people are actually using this stuff that at the beginning of the life cycle we think is so darned important that we put a lot of energy into it, we optimize our pipelines, we crank these things out, and then they just sit there, right? It's like inventory sitting on a shelf in a warehouse. It's bad business. So you want to be able to measure that and knock it out, knock it off. Service quality, stability, and maturity, these things are pretty standard in our world. There's a lot of great ways to measure those. They have to be included here. They're very, very important. If you're a SaaS provider, obviously that's paramount. But if you're not a SaaS provider, you care about that stuff too. You want your software delivered to be good and usable, and so on. Service velocity and operational efficiency rounded out. And they're more DevOps centric. You could make the case that all of these impact each other. This is a categorization just to help break things up so that we can think about it a little bit more. So, busy slide. I like slides that have a lot of graphics and diagrams, but I wanted you guys to have a takeaway from this that maybe you could chew on a little bit. So what I've done here is laid out across those different areas that we just talked about, lots of different metrics that we see being valuable, that we see our customers using, that we hear our customers talking about, that we can strategize with and help folks implement ways of collecting and using. So I wanted to talk about a few of them across the top. Business service impact is a specific metric that's concerned with the business value to the market that talks about the benefit of the delivered digital value to the business. Well, the question then becomes how much you measure that, right? Well, some really gross measurements are improved earnings, right? I delivered a new feature out to the market. What happened to our earnings? Did it have a measurable impact on that? What about our cash flow, our market share, our account growth, right? Maybe there's a feature that has to be there in our product so that we can better compete. And wouldn't it be great if we could directly trace that back to the work that we delivered and the speed that we got it out with? So it turns out there's some strategies that we can employ to actually do that. Another really neat metric at the business performance level, is business service delivery, so business value to the business. And this gets into the velocity of being able to get stuff out and get it to our customers, and helping us understand kind of what I was talking about before. Is this having an impact on you? Are these features that we're pushing out useful to you? The next couple metrics talk about that as well, breadth of use and frequency of use. And as you'll see on the next, well, I'll go into it on the next slide, but they go to applicability and utility, as you can see here. And I'll take a pause. Are there any of these that you guys are looking at here that are of particular interest that you'd like to dissect a little further? Yes?
I'm kind of curious how you define that the request has been made of the business. A lot of times that's in an informal way or formal way. It's at a meeting, and where you say, yeah, that'll be in a future release.
Right.
Right.
So what we try to do is drive everything down to some time-stampable event. So, and I'm going to get to this in a little bit, but typically there's going to be a ticketing system, either on the front end or the back end of the life cycle, where that change request or that new feature request has been approved and then put into the current plan. And that would be the time that the clock would start. And depending on how you wanted to measure it, you might actually end up instrumenting your software and not getting confirmation that a particular piece of value is being utilized until it's been deployed for some time, right? Until somebody actually starts using it. To achieve that, you'd have to instrument your code so that it would phone home, right? When it had been utilized. So the important thing is to pick a start and a stop and then keep them consistent, right? It's less important to get it exactly right? We just want to be able to get that gap because what we're really going to end up looking for are trends, right? Great question. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
What are some good ways to measure, talking about effort and cost, without tracking people's hours and things like that?
So, yeah. So the only way that we've been able to find to do it without a time tracking system is to look at your population, look at elapsed time, look at the volume of work that was done, and you can use some simple approaches to allocate it grossly, right, back to where it must have come from, right? Does that make sense?
What do you mean by volume?
So let's say it's one team, 7 people. They did 5 features over the year, right? Just to make numbers up quickly, let's say 6. And so what did I say, 5? Let's say it's 6 people. So 6 person years of effort, 6 features. There's a person year per feature, roughly. That's a way to do it. So again, it's not, making this a precise science is probably going to be very, very, very challenging, right? And we would have to, probably go to the extreme of putting GPS trackers on everybody and eye trackers and, keyboard trackers and the whole 9 yards to get super granular and be scientifically precise. But we don't need to, because in the end, we want to get the gross measures and see if we're improving, right? Good stuff. Yes, sir.
So I would assume the same is generally true for the cost of release, right? It seems like really hard to quantify that super scientifically, so it's some kind of swag at that. What are some ways that would be done?
So cost of release, and that one's pretty trackable really, because you can look at all the use, let's say you're using a use case-based approach. You can look at the use cases that you've injected into the pipelines. You can track them through the pipelines, and you can then map back to the personnel on the teams, make some assumptions about their time allocation, and crank out the math. And if you have it set up right, that can all be done automatically, and you can spit answers out the back end that again show trending, right? And give us some data that helps us steer the ship, right? It may not be GPS precision steerage, right? But it's better than I'm going to throw it over there and see what sticks. And that's what we're looking for. Great questions. Any others?
One of the things that we're struggling with would be is DevOps, my organization gets blank group, and we're looking at, I'm getting the QA group saying, all the systems are down, that they've been down for X amount of time, and I'm looking at our incidents, and it's the point where all network operations, half dev, basically introduced 2/3 of the defects that effectively cause configuration. So how are you taking the metrics to the organizations that you have actionables?
So let me make sure that I really understand the question, right? It goes back to the complexity of all the different moving parts making.
Organizations that are involved in maybe what gets blamed on DevOps to the point where my boss says DevOps gurus. As a point where when I look at the actual incidents, it's a point where we've got maybe 10% of them. Development team, you've got maybe about 40% of them. Network, you got X amount. Infrastructure, you got Y amount. To the point where I'm trying to get the action plans to the organizations, even QA. Your testing is screwed up. Your test is wrong. You wrote an incident when you didn't have it.
So this really kind of gets into a little bit of a different area, but it's a super important area. To me, the question you're asking gets into the culture and the organizational aspects of it. And you know, in the high-performing organizations that we run into, the blame game has to get eradicated to a very large extent. There has to be a culture of we're all on the same team, and if there's a problem, it's everybody's problem. It's not he said, she said, finger pointing. It's let's just go fix it and let's get it done. That's not exactly something I'm trying to measure here. There's a lot of great folks who have done a lot of agile consulting and a lot of DevOps consulting who are specialists in that kind of an area. But that would be the manifesto-based ideal would suggest that we work in a little more harmony, and those things aren't as big an issue. Questions? Did I answer your question? Hope I did. Kind of. Right. Yeah, and it's not uncommon, right? And that's one of the big things that we hope to break through with not just Dev and Ops working together closely, but bringing the business side of it in and getting that whole triad pulling on the same rope. And it's a hard thing to do. And in my experience, I'm a tools guy. I'm a software engineering tools guy. I kind of focus on the technology side and the fun stuff that I can control, you know, programmatically or through automated means. The cultural side is huge in this, right? Anybody else in the room, any of your organizations having any cultural adoption issues with DevOps? Anybody? Everybody? Right, so you're not alone. You're not alone. We see it all the time. And that's really, if you look at some of the analyses of the high performers and the continuum from there, it's a huge factor in what you get out of this. Okay, so this slide then is just a little detail, maybe some high-level suggested algorithmic approaches, super high level, about how to go about collecting some of this stuff. And where I am heading with this, and what we've seen work, is to kind of map it into different areas of automation where you can collect this information and synthesize it and get it spat out of your system so that you can create the data, get the data, analyze it, and put it into that closed loop so that you can make the strategic decisions. And it introduces a couple of new areas. We talked about it briefly before. We might have to end up instrumenting our code so that we can see where folks are using it, how frequently they use it, under what conditions they use it, how long they use it. And that's really easy to do when you're a SaaS or a PaaS provider. It's less easy to do when your stuff gets installed on-prem, but there's still ways you can go about doing it, right? You can create little packets. You can ask for permission to email those home. You can pick it up when you go visit and bring that back. Go visit your customers. You can pick it up and bring it back. So there's ways to get this data. It's very, very important to get it. That's the instrumentation piece. We might have to end up doing surveys. We might have to look at annual statements. We might have to interface with the finance department to get the effect on the cash flow and the market share and all that good stuff. But it's worth doing, right? Because if we can correlate in time the introduction of new capabilities and features and as they hit the market and see what effect that has on the business and factor out the other things that might be going on, we're able to distill down and see what's happening at that level. The activity logging we talked about, change requests we talked about a little bit, application release automation or pipeline automation. Obviously, as your features and your digital value move through pipelines, there's great opportunities to collect value here. Who knows, you might implement something that pushes a new release out to production, and maybe you have application performance monitoring on the production sites. They notice a degradation in performance. It's possible nowadays to kick back into the pipeline and say, whoa, undo that because it's not working right. And just have an automated loop right there. And we can track that. We can see how often that goes. And just little tactics like that can have a huge impact on metrics that talk about performance and uptime and things of that nature. So there's some heuristics there. And the idea then is to come back to our framework and talk about how we might automate all of this. We know we want to measure it. We know we want to assess it. It turns out that there's just a few key ingredients that if you have in place, you can get a long way toward collecting this data pretty easily. And the ones we see over and over again are a ticketing system or a planning system on the front end. We see a lot of Jira out there. That's great. Application release automation. There's clearly a lot of great vendors in that space, a lot of great approaches, a lot of great tooling out there to help with that. And then, on the operational side, you'd want to marry in your ticketing, your service management ticketing system so that you could close the loop on that end. High-level strategy for getting the detail you need to move forward. Oh yeah, and surveys, right? Who's friendly with SurveyMonkey? I love that thing. SurveyMonkey's awesome. So yeah, good stuff there. The tools are out there. All you got to do is think about it. You got to plug it in and collect the data and then look for those trends. That's really the secret to success in terms of bridging this gap. Any other questions? We've got just a couple minutes left. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, in my example, it would be to go back and and get some of this business service. So ask the customer, right? Reach out to the customer. How valuable is this feature to you? How valuable is this new release? How long did it take before it was available, before you decided to install it? Why? Right? Information like that is super critical so that you can feed it back into that strategy. Maybe our assumptions when we strategize are completely invalid. We think we know what the market wants, but unless we ask it, how do we, right? Yes, sir.
So I think maybe there are two stages to that as far as determining what the value is. There's an expected value that you'd be getting, right? Which shows
Sure.
effectiveness. Are we working on the right things? And then I guess on this tail end, are we actually getting the value?
Are we getting it? And before and an after. Yeah, that's very, very useful information. It's up to your organization. We do ours just a while after a release, a couple, 3 times a year. But it's whatever your customers can bear and what you need, right? Thanks, everybody. We'll cut it off.